Hello and welcome to Ask an Addict here at the Rewired Soul. My name's Chris, and this is a whole series where you get to ask somebody who's in recovery some questions. I work in the industry. I get questions all the time from both people who are in recovery as well as friends and family members who want just specific answers about getting sober, staying sober, family interactions, anything that your mind can think of. So that's what this series is about. So one of the number one questions that I get from people who are newly sober is, what do I do, or how do I get my family to understand my addiction? I get that question all the time. And we have to sit back and kind of think about it. Why is it so important for friends or family members to understand our addiction? And I have to look back at my own experience because I speak from a place of experience, especially when it comes to this question. So, before I get into my answer, here's a little bit about how it went for me. When I first got sober back in 2012, the most difficult relationship I had was with my son's mother. We had been split up for a year or two. I hadn't seen my son in the last 4 months because I was drinking and using so much. And then I go and I get sober, and I'm getting 30 days, 60 days, and I'm reading and I'm learning and I'm understanding addiction. I'm going to meetings and all sorts of stuff. And the whole time I was there, all I could think about was my son's mom needs to go through this stuff so she understands what I'm going through. And I just kept thinking that. I kept being so adamant about it. I had these books and I just wanted her to read them. And maybe if she could read them, then maybe she would understand what I'm going through. And at the end of the day, when I look at it and I unpack that, I kind of just wanted her to cut me a break. I wanted her to give me some slack. I wanted her to understand that I have a sickness. You need to leave me alone because I'm a sick individual. That, at the end of the day, that's really what I was looking for. So, if you're asking this question, I want you to sit back and kind of just get some curiosity about, where is this question coming from? Many times when I'm talking to my clients, that's something that I ask them to do quite often, is rather than thinking about the question, back it up a few steps and say, where is this question coming from? Because like I said, in my experience, I wanted her to start giving me a pass. I wanted her to start cutting me some slack, right? So what ended up happening was I kept talking to people and just saying like, why won't she just read this book? Why won't she go to Al-Anon? Why won't she go to therapy? Why won't she do these things to understand my addiction? I'm her son's father. And as much as it hurt to hear it, I had people in my life who told me what I need to hear rather than what I want to hear, and they looked me dead in the eyes, and they said, Chris, this is your disease. It is not hers. And I was like, oh, what? How dare you? Right? But that's the way my brain works, is that I want everybody to pity me. I want everybody to feel sorry for me. So I want them to start being worried about what's going on with me, because the last thing that I want to do is think about how my disease is affecting them. And it was a really hard pill to swallow when they were telling me it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if she gets it or not. And it took a while for me to accept that, but it was absolutely true. Even to this day, she knows a little bit more about it than she did, but she never went to a class on addiction. I have an addiction class up on the rewiredsoul.com. She hasn't taken it, and she doesn't need to. Doesn't need to at all, and that's totally cool with me. I had to realize that my recovery, my sobriety, has to be completely independent of anything else. Whether or not my friends or family understand, whether or not I'm in a relationship or not, whether or not I have a job, I need to stay clean no matter what. Because what we come to realize through our recovery, or just through life in general, or when we're working on our mental health, is how little control we actually have. I used to have this delusion that I could control other people. I could talk to them or convince them of why they need to do certain things. And then at the end of the day, if they were running off free will, which everybody is, they didn't do what I wanted them to do. And it would drive me nuts. And then what would happen? I'd get depressed. I would go into self-pity. Maybe I'd get angry. And these are all the things that line up perfectly that lead me back to that first drink or drug. So the more I obsess around what other people are doing or what I want them to think of me or how I want them to understand me, every minute I do that, that's less that we're focusing on our recovery. So when I get this question from my clients day in and day out, I tell them it doesn't matter. They don't need to. Because I often relate addiction to cancer, which has made some people in the comments pretty upset, but it's an illness, it's a disease. At the end of the day, if your friends, if your family members, if they understood cancer, it wouldn't treat your cancer. That's just the bottom line. You would need to go get it treated no matter how much they understand about it. Them understanding it wouldn't help anything at all. It might help you get a little empathy. It might help you get a little bit of compassion. But other than that, the problem's still there and you need to do what you have to do to treat your illness. Same thing with your addiction. Because the last thing you want to do is set this goal. Well, maybe if my family or if my friends or if my husband, if my wife, if my dog, if my kid, whoever it is, if they just understood my disease, then I'll be okay. Well, what that is, that's putting our happiness, our mental health, our sobriety on somebody else. And then what happens when they do understand it? Let's say they go and get a bachelor's degree in addiction. And then all of a sudden you realize that you're still not satisfied. They just went through school for this thing. They understand everything there is to know about addiction, but you still have this kind of emptiness inside of you, right? So that's why we need to quit relying on all these outside sources to, let our sobriety be what it can be. We need to get that idea out of our heads. Now, the reason I talk about it like this is because there are a lot of people out there who we end up pushing to a point where they don't care. They don't want to know anything about it. There's a huge stigma. There's a lot of lack of education about addiction. And what I do and what many other people around the country do is that we try to increase awareness. We try to get rid of the stigma. That's what we're trying to do. But if you're early in recovery, just focus on your recovery. Maybe someday we'll be teaching kids about this in school. So in a couple generations, the new parents, when their son or daughter becomes addicted, they'll understand. But for right now, that's not happening. But don't get me wrong, I have family members who ask me and they say, Chris, what can I do to best support my son or daughter's recovery? Or I have husbands and wives and they say, how can I support them? Then by all means, I will just bring in a dump truck and give them all the resources they want. But we have to set our expectations realistically. We can't expect every family member, every friend to be like that. And then what ends up happening too is we put ourselves in all these tricky situations. Someone does something that we don't like, or maybe they disrespected our recovery. And at the end of the day, it's just because they didn't know any better. But we get offended by it. But we just have to realize that that's ignorance. It's going to happen. We need to let it slide. Me personally today, trust me, when I do these videos and when I write articles, all that kind of stuff, that's just coming from a place of increasing awareness. But I'm not some crazy person who runs around on the Las Vegas Strip where I live. Well, I don't live on the Strip, but near the Strip. I don't run around there and just preaching the word of addiction recovery. That's not what I do. But I do go to situations where people want to ask me questions about it. They want to know. They're like, Chris, how do you do this? How do you stay sober and still have fun? Chris, how do you go to concerts and stay sober? Chris, how do you stay sober on Christmas? Chris, how did you go to the emergency room in all that pain and not take a pain medication? And people will ask me that, and I'll tell them. And there are people who come to me and they know I'm in recovery. They know that I work in the field. And they'll say, hey, I have a brother or a sister or whoever it may be who has a problem. What can I do to help them? And in all honesty, I'd say maybe it's a surprisingly low number, but maybe only 25% of them even take my advice. A lot of people feel very hopeless and helpless when it comes to helping someone they know who has an addiction. And that's even more of the reason why we need to take it into our own hands. See, just the other day I was talking to a mom, and her son is newly sober, and he isn't doing anything for his recovery. Anything at all. No therapy, no meetings, no sober living, just nothing. Just absolutely nothing. I'm the type of person, by the way, where I'll say, like, just pick one thing. I don't care what you do for your recovery, just do something. But this mom's telling me about how her son's not doing anything. But on a day-to-day basis, he's telling her what she needs to do to help his recovery. And that's not what we do. We don't do that. We need to work on ourselves. And I guarantee you, I would bet anything on this because I've seen it happen countless times, that when you keep working on you, the rest of the world begins to change. And it's not necessarily because the people in the world are changing, but your perspective begins to change. So as your perspective begins to change, you stop having all this anger or frustration towards the world and people who don't understand addiction. And at the end of the day, the reality is, if you want to be around people who understand addiction, go hang out with other drug addicts and alcoholics who are trying to stay sober. That's why we have sober support groups. That's why we go and hang out with these people, because they are the ones who get it. Family, friends, even if they got it to a certain point, they're never fully going to understand. They're never fully going to understand what it's like to not want to use, but to have to use. You know? They look at us like we're crazy, like, huh? Right? Or when we tell them, like, hey, you know, it's been 90 days and I still have intense cravings. They're going to say, well, just don't do it. So remember that. Even if your family or friends are supportive, they're still going to be a lot different than your support group unless they have personally struggled with addiction themselves. So don't forget that. So remember, when asking the question of what do you do when your friends or family members or parents or whoever it is don't understand addiction, what do you do? Remember, you focus on you. That's it. That's the easiest solution ever. You keep it simple. Focus on yourself. Focus on your recovery. Learn everything that you can about staying sober, and the rest will fall into place. I absolutely guarantee it. But that's all I got for this episode of Ask an Addict. Do me a favor, leave comments below. If you have any questions about getting sober, staying sober, if you have a friend or family member who is still in their addiction or they're in early recovery and you don't know what to do with them, any questions you have about recovery, leave them in the comments below because it's going to help me get more topics to bring to you. And remember, I guarantee that any question that you have, there's at least one other person who has that same question. So you are doing them a favor by bringing that question to the table. So don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe, and I will see you next time.